Around 1987, 88, I was in middle school. I had grown 6 inches and I was about 70 pounds lighter than I am now. So I was a gangly, awkward, uncomfortable with my body teenager. And not only was I uncomfortable with my body, I was just generally socially awkward, chronically shy, and uncomfortable with myself in most settings. Does that sound like anybody else's middle school experience? So all that means is I had no self-confidence, and when you don't have self-confidence, it's hard to show up in spaces, right, and to be fully present and do the things you need to do. Now, I moved on and got to high school, and my parents were always super supportive. I had some outstanding teachers and some coaches that were great at encouragement, and I slowly began to build self-confidence and get comfortable showing up in spaces as myself. And when you have self-confidence, it's a little bit easier to, at least try new things or get things done, build some competence along the way. Fast forward a few more years, and I'm a sophomore in college. I have just transferred from one school to another. My brothers were a senior in high school and a junior in high school, so my dad is facing, we got to figure out how to pay for 3 kids in college pretty soon all at the same time. I was home for a wrestling tournament that my brother was in. I'm sitting next to my dad. He doesn't even look at me, and he says, "I quit my job this morning." Now, I have to back up so you can understand how that landed on me. When I was a junior in high school, during the recession, my dad lost his job and was out of work for 9 months. And that was a very formative time for me of, what happens when there's no money coming in? And then he eventually got a job. It wasn't a great job. And then he had a job where his boss was sexually harassing people, and he got out of that place into the job that he was in. And so for him to say, "I quit my job," what I'm hearing is, uh-oh. And so I then say, "Well, what's happened?" He goes, "Well, my boss hired me he said, I found out, hired me so he could get rid of somebody else. And as soon as I finish this thing, he's going to get rid of me too. And I don't like the way this is unfolding. So I went in this morning, negotiated myself some severance pay, walked up to a meeting with the boss and said I quit, and walked right out of there." I said, "Oh, so you got something lined up?" "Nope." And I remember thinking, right now, remember, I had no confidence, and I had gotten to a place of self-confidence. I remember thinking, that is a level of confidence I am never going to have in myself, that I can quit my job after not having a job and having 3 kids to feed that ate a lot of food and getting all college stuff. But here's what I didn't understand at that point in time. Today, actually, is the 25th anniversary of my dad's death. And when he died, he had been sober for 20 years. And I don't remember the time before that, but I can assume that he had hit rock bottom and that somehow God dragged him out of that place to a place of sobriety, and that was an experience of grace that helped him see that there were things that God could do that were beyond his ability to do them himself. So that day when he quit that job, it was not confidence in himself that allowed him to do that, but confidence in what God is capable of doing beyond what we can do. Because if we don't have any confidence, it's really hard to face any kind of challenge. If we have self-confidence, we can handle things that we can get our minds and our hearts around. But when life hits us with circumstances, with opportunities, with anything that just seems well beyond our abilities to cope with, to deal with, to live into, we can't do that with self-confidence. That's where I think we need God confidence, right? Confidence in the work that God can do. Now again, sophomore in college, I didn't have any thoughts like that. I just thought my dad was being foolish. Which brings me to our text from Corinthians today, where Paul starts off and talks about the foolishness of the cross. And he says that the foolishness of the cross is actually wisdom, and that God's wisdom is wiser than, or God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness, right, on the cross is stronger than human strength. Now, at the time, I didn't understand any of that, but I think the same pattern holds true, right? So, no confidence to self-confidence to God confidence. I think the same can hold for wisdom, which is some things in life are just foolish. All that, right? There's just foolishness. Then we can get to a place where we have wisdom, and that's wisdom like the world's wisdom, right? We can be wise with our finances. We can be wise with our choices, right? And that wisdom, I think, can help us navigate the stuff, again, that we can get our minds around, the day-to-day things that we encounter. But when we encounter those things where we have no idea what to do, no idea how we're going to get through it, when life is landing heavy on us and we just are completely lost, our wisdom doesn't get us very far, and that's where we need God's wisdom, which may, in fact, feel like foolishness. Now, how do we apply that to our lives, though, is the question I was wrestling with this week, right? Because if we have foolishness, and then we have our wisdom, but if our wisdom doesn't, get us very far without God's wisdom, how do we know which is God's wisdom and which is us having our wisdom? And I came to two conclusions, one that has to do with perspective and one that has to do with humility. Because ultimately, I think it comes down to discernment. How are we hearing God? How are we hearing God's wisdom? How are we listening for what God is calling us to and how that calls us into places? And that happens best in community, but I think perspective helps. And I'll give you an example. I want you to imagine a photograph of two people, a man and woman, standing next to a train, and there's a conductor looking at his watch. If you imagine that picture, does it tell you a story? Yeah. You don't have all the details, but you can look at it and go, oh, it looks like they're about to say goodbye. It looks like the train's getting ready to leave. And you can kind of get a little bit of a story. Now, if I take that still snapshot and turn it into a movie, I can actually tell you much more story, right? It could be a romantic comedy, and they're about to have a split that's going to get reconciled later in the movie. It could be that one of them's a spy and is pretending like they're talking to the other one while the bad guys go by. It could be that it's an action movie, a drama, right? And that still snapshot then becomes a much fuller picture when you know the whole story. We actually see this in Scripture. When Jesus is Palm Sunday, which we'll celebrate in a few weeks. On Palm Sunday, Jesus marches into Jerusalem, right? Well, in Jesus' day, in the Roman Empire, generals and emperors would win big battles when they conquered new places. And when they came back, they would have a victory parade and build themselves a big fancy victory arch that had carvings that told the whole story of their conquest. They would ride in on like a war horse with all of the spoils of war and the slaves trailing behind them. So when Jesus rides into Jerusalem, a city in the empire, on a donkey, in a parade, with people holding up palm branches in an arch, what is he doing? He's mocking the emperor right out in public. Is that foolish or wise? If you're just looking at that snapshot, pretty foolish. If you're the disciples on Good Friday and you see the result of mocking the emperor and Jesus hanging on the cross and dying, does your whole effort of following him to that point seem foolish or wise? Pretty foolish until the resurrection. And then all of a sudden, all of that foolishness comes to this place of new life and wonder and miracle and all kinds of other things. So what seems like foolishness, right, in the snapshot, with God's wisdom, if you get the bigger picture, is a whole different thing. The problem is we encounter the world so often in snapshots. I'm going to bet that all of us have been in a grocery store where a kid had a meltdown. And you probably, I'm just guessing, thought, well, if they just discipline their kid a little bit more at home, this wouldn't happen. Or if they just, right, fill in the blanks of all the parenting wisdom that you would apply to that situation. But you're only seeing a snapshot, right? You're seeing that moment. What you may not know is that kid may have sensory issues and developmental things going on that make loud noises, crowds, and busy places really challenging. And maybe routines is how they cope with that, but they had to be out of routine all morning, and now mom had to absolutely go get groceries or they're not going to eat that day because they're out of food, and so they have to be at the grocery store, and there's a big loud bang because something happens, and now the kid's in a meltdown space. How much does all of your wisdom mean then? Not much, because you only saw the snapshot, you didn't see the whole movie, right? So God's wisdom, right, is a whole movie, and we see sometimes just the snapshot of foolishness. But when we take the world in those ways where it's easy for us to just kind of get moments and judge them and then respond to them, maybe our wisdom can get us through some easy ones, but when we get to the hard ones, we perhaps need some more perspective. I'll give you an example. My internship congregation in Littleton, Colorado sat not too far from Columbine High School. When the Columbine High School shootings happened, you have to respond, right? And so what did the congregation do with the snapshot? Because sometimes you have to respond to the snapshot. They said, well, we're a church. What do we do? And they said, we worship, we have communion, we pray, and we sing. So let's just start there, which is what they did. And kids brought football jerseys and memorabilia from their friends that had died, and they had a whole big moment. So in the moment, they dealt with the crisis. But then they asked the question and said, why? What's the whole movie, not just the snapshot? Why did this happen in our community? And what is it that we could maybe do? What might God be calling us to do? Now, the congregation had just built a big, new, amazing sanctuary and borrowed way more money than is probably reasonable to do so. And they went and they listened to the community. And what they found out was that there weren't really lots of places for young people to gather. Like community centers that are now there weren't there. And so they looked around and they said, you know what? The youth need a place. We should build it. Now, you just borrowed a whole bunch of money to build the thing that you haven't paid for yet. Should you borrow more money to build on some more? In this day and age, I would not borrow money to build on a big old church thing, right? But you could look at that, and I guarantee someone stood up at the meeting and said, this is foolish. They ended up building a 3-story addition to the building that in the basement had a full high school youth room that was decked out with all kinds of cool stuff, a middle school youth room, an auditorium. The next floor had a gym, classrooms on the top that got used for Bible study. And by the time I arrived, like 8-10 years later, they had the highest debt per worshiper ratio in the ELCA. So you can look and go, well, that seems foolish. I was, for my 2 years, I had 7th grade confirmation. That was 100 kids. There were 100 kids in 6th grade confirmation, 100 kids in 8th grade confirmation. There were Cub Scout troops and Boy Scout troops using that space. There were a preschool in the building that then now functioned and used that space. So they felt God calling them, right, to build a space for young people to be, and they were living into it. Is the congregation still there? Yeah. Are they paying off the debt? Sure. We had to borrow money sometimes to meet payroll, but the foolishness and the wisdom of God, sometimes it's kind of hard to tell. The point being, the discernment that they did was to listen to the community, listen to what God was calling them to do, and when they ran up to the foolishness, together sort of discern, yep, we're going to be foolish with this one because this is where we feel God's wisdom might be bigger than ours. Now, you might come to a different conclusion at a different point in time in a similar situation. And you might have your own journeys of life that are challenging, which is why we don't do these things alone. We do them in conversation and discernment with one another so we can listen for how God might be calling us to be and what God might be calling us to do. Which brings me to the second thing, which is humility. If you think you know and are certain what God is calling you to do, what do you stop doing? Listening, right? If you got an answer, why should you be curious? And so I think as we venture into these places of wondering what the wisdom of God or the foolishness of God might be as we're trying to discern that, a little bit of humility might be helpful. When I was an intern, I also got to visit Haiti, and I went back a few years later. And when you visit Haiti, you find a place whose infrastructure is absolutely crumbling, a government that is non-functional. Today you got people getting kidnapped and all kinds of terrible things. And what we do as Americans, if we show up, is say, how can we help? Now, the worst versions of that, you show up and just start working and doing things that a Haitian could be doing for themselves, and you take a job away from them. The best version of it is, what do you need? And they say, well, we don't need you to pay for our teachers, because then if you stop giving us money, we can't pay our teachers. But you could help us do this, that, or the other and walk alongside and accompany us. Where I get frustrated is some of those very same places, right? The leaders that are from Haiti might come to the U.S., and what do? We have the president of the Lutheran Church of Haiti comes to visit every once in a while. There's a couple other guys I know. We bring them, we have them come tell their stories, and we raise money to send them back so that we can help them do what they're doing. Nowhere in there did we ask a question of, what can we learn from you? Right? We assume our wisdom and our experience and our know-how is what they need because their infrastructure is crumbling and all the rest of these things. I know 3 Haitian people that are absolutely brilliant at building community. They know how to go out into the neighborhood and find people and get them connected and grow community organizations. We live in a culture that has got an epidemic of loneliness. Do we ever look at them and say, hey, could you teach us that? Like, our context is different, but there must be something you're doing that we can learn from. And the answer is, no, we don't ask that because we think we have all the wisdom and the answers to share with them, and what could they possibly help us with? And the answer is, a lot. If we have some humility and understand that what might seem like foolishness to us might be God's foolishness that turns into wisdom that is better than the wisdom that we can come up with at any point in time. Jesus' death on the cross seems foolish. Giving us water as a sign for something might seem foolish until you start realizing it's all around us all the time. Giving us a meal to gather around might have seemed like a foolish thing to disciples, and yet we continue to do it because the elements of it are right here and around us all the time. The new life that Jesus has in resurrection is what makes that foolishness wisdom. And so my hope and prayer for us as we continue our journey as a congregation is that we can recognize that some things are just foolish and just go, nope, that's foolish. That we can use our wisdom of the world to navigate the things that we know how and can get our minds around, right? We should balance our checkbooks and, do all those things with the wisdom that we have. But then also to trust that when we're facing something that seems beyond us, or maybe feeling a call from God to do something that seems a little bit ridiculous, that God's foolishness, if we can just take that step back and discern together, might actually be the wisdom that takes us to places that we can't imagine going, can't imagine getting there, and can't ever figure out the path between the two, but knowing that God can do that for us because God's wisdom is indeed greater than ours, and even God's foolishness is. Amen.